And with this process there is a considerable release of energy, and we've demonstrated that this could be sustained on its own. In other words, much more energy is coming out than we're putting in. In 1989, two researchers called Pons and Fleischmann held a press conference announcing to the world that they created cold fusion in a test tube. It was one of those too good to be true moments that was, too good to be true. I often used to go to press conferences like this where a new discovery was announced, and while most reporters duly scribbled it down and asked excited questions, the first thing the science journalists wanted to know was, where has this been published? Now, why is that important? In this video we're going to find out. And along the way you will learn how to publish your very own scientific paper, even if you've never touched a test tube since elementary school. You'll find out how to tell the difference between real scientific journals and phony ones. So a quick quiz question here. Which of these two journals is real and is cited by researchers? And which one will publish any old bullshit for money? The International Journal of Advanced Computer Technology or the Journal of Computer and System Sciences? And we'll find out why this is not a good idea. Before I look at science at its best, let's first look at junk science at its worst, because a lot of people are confused about the reliability of scientific journals and they rewrite to be skeptical. With the rise of the internet, the number of scientific journals has ballooned, and we've seen a steep rise in the number of fraudulent papers retracted. Example: in 2013, Ocorrafoo Cobange of the Wessie Institute of Medicine submitted a paper to the Journal of Natural Pharmaceuticals. The paper described the anti-cancer properties of a chemical found in lichen and was duly peer-reviewed and published. Only problem was, Ocorrafoo Cobange was a made-up name, the Wessie Institute of Medicine didn't exist, the anti-cancer chemical didn't exist, and the paper was complete nonsense. The real author, John Bohannon of Science magazine, deliberately wrote a bogus paper that he says a high school chemistry student should have been able to spot in order to test the robustness of peer review in these new-only journals. He submitted different versions of the bogus paper to 304 journals, and like the Journal of Natural Pharmaceuticals, more than half accepted it. Why? Because a lot of these only journals will publish anything as long as you pay. To start one, all it takes is a keyboard, a telephone line, and a bank account. The most predatory of these newly formed so-called journals sends out thousands of emails to researchers inviting them to submit papers and then charges them a couple of $100s for publication. Now, when I say these journals will publish anything, I mean anything. And you rethinking, we know, nonsense science, you've proved your point. No, I mean anything. One researcher was so fed up getting spam emails from predatory journals that he wrote back begging them to take him off their mailing list. When that didn't work, he relented and decided to submit a paper titled "Get Me Off Your Fing Mailing List," complete with an abstract, an introduction, points of methodology, diagrams and charts, and a summary. And you probably think the punchline of this story is that the paper was accepted. Well, yes, it was, by the International Journal of Advanced Computer Technology. With minor changes, the editor told him, and you have to wonder what the minor changes were. Did Bohannon make a scientific error somewhere in the text by writing "please"? Yes. This is the same International Journal of Advanced Computer Technology showed you at the beginning of the video. It's hard to tell on the face of it that it's any worse than the Journal of Computer and System Sciences. But the latter is at the other end of the scale. And others at the end of the scale. It's a traditional journal that was in print long before the internet came along. It's properly peer-reviewed and highly cited by other researchers. Traditional journals like this have been the mainstay of scientific publishing since the Philosophical Transactions of the Royal Society was published 350 years ago, and is still going strong today. Unlike pay-to-play journals, these traditional journals don't urge researchers to publish their work. Instead, they make their money from subscriptions, from libraries, institutes, and researchers who need access to the best and latest scientific information. That's a crucial difference. It means they are dependent for their survival on the quality and accuracy of what they publish. Predatory-only journals survive by publishing as many papers as they can, regardless of accuracy, because they make their money from quantity, not quality. Outside of this body of knowledge are discussion papers and posters presented at conferences and seminars. Again, this is traditional publishing, but while these papers may look impressive, they aren't always peer-reviewed. This one, presented at the Lunar and Planetary Science Conference, and looking very respectable, comes from a physicist who was arguing that an ancient Martian civilization was wiped out by a planetary-wide nuclear explosion. When I write a peer-reviewed paper in a scientific journal, journal of the world. Same goes for opinion pieces and articles written in magazines affiliated with scientific institutions. When Christopher Monckton tried to pass off his opinion piece in the Forum of Physics and Society as a peer-reviewed paper, the editors added an annotation stating that it most certainly was not. These conference papers and opinion pieces aren't peer-reviewed because they read just a free flow of ideas. So why aren't researchers equally free to publish whatever they like in peer-reviewed journals? It's a question Ben Stein posed in his movie Expelled. I have always assumed that scientists were free to ask any question, to pursue any line of inquiry, without fear of reprisal. Well, yes, of course they were, as we've seen. Of course, they can ask whatever they like and say whatever they like, even if it's a speculation or complete crap. But that doesn't mean scientific journals have to publish all this speculation and claptrap. In fact, they have a very clear responsibility to not publish speculation and claptrap. Because, as I've said before, they are the repository of our current scientific knowledge. If one bad paper gets into the system, one piece of crap, one miscalculation, or a wild speculation touted as fact, it could get cited by another paper, and that paper could get cited by another, and our repository of scientific knowledge becomes tainted. Since all life can be found in the Seinfeld Chronicles, it's a bit like they bow on the smelly valet that gets transferred into Jerry's car. What? Do you smell something? And the smell transfers to everyone it comes into contact with. But to Ben Stein, keeping this crap from tainting our body of scientific knowledge is censorship. It all began when I met evolutionary biologist Richard Sternberg in Washington, D.C. His life was nearly ruined when he strayed from the party line while serving as editor of a scientific journal affiliated with the prestigious Smithsonian Museum of Natural History. What was Dr. Sternberg's crime? He dared to publish an article by Dr. Stephen Meyer, one of the leading lights of the intelligent design movement. The paper ignited a firestorm of controversy merely because it suggested intelligent design might be able to explain how life began. This supposed example of censorship got a lot of attention, so let's go through this one by one. No, it wasn't the questioning of Darwinism that's a problem. Darwin's ideas have been challenged and refuted in the scientific literature hundreds of times. His idea that life might have begun in warm muddy ponds has been challenged. His tree of life has been challenged. His idea that natural selection is driven by mutations has been challenged. So that wasn't the reason the editor got in trouble. The mentioning of intelligent design that occurs at the end of the paper now we read getting warmer. Stephen Meyer did indeed mention intelligent design at the end of the paper, but it was in the most important part, the conclusion. And throughout the paper Meyer was making an argument for intelligent design, even though he was careful not to call it that. His argument was that the animal phyla of the Cambrian period 500 million years ago were incredibly complex, and that complex objects require an intelligent agent to make them. He also argued that these organisms had no antecedents except single-celled organisms. He wasn't saying that paleontologists had found any antecedents yet, which could possibly be argued. He was arguing that there were none to find. That's pure speculation. Even the papers he cited to support that argument didn't support anything of the kind. So what got Sternberg into trouble wasn't any questioning of Darwinism or a single mention of intelligent design right at the end of the paper. It was publishing a paper full of factual errors and wild speculation, neither of which should be tainting the peer-reviewed scientific literature. You stink. Normally this kind of thing is published in something like Answers Journal, which may call itself a professional peer-reviewed technical journal, but kind of gives the game away from the perspective of the recent creation and global flood. No one in the rational world takes creationist papers seriously. So a junk science paper that manages to get into a real scientific journal can then be cited to influence public debate, government policy, and even legal cases. For example, creationists used the Meyer paper to try to get creationism taught at Dover High School. In a landmark legal case they fought to prove that intelligent design was legitimate science, and they cited the fact that it was published in a respected peer-reviewed journal as evidence. It seems that any religious group, political organization, or citizen scientist who can to get his pet beliefs published because of a lack of evidence never accepts that the lack of evidence is a just reason for not publishing. It's always a scientific conspiracy against them. There is a kind of conspiracy of silence among certain scientists. They know, but are not telling you, that the upper tectonic plates of Earth, I presume you think it's agent global conspiracy to cover up the fact that the Earth is flat. Why would they do that? There probably are financial motives behind it. And if a scientific paper isn't up to scratch, it's never the errors or a lack of originality that's to blame. It has to be censorship. The National Academy of Sciences came out with a report stating mouse are safe to eat. A few years ago I covered a similar case of an editor who got into trouble for allowing crap to be published under his watch. The journal was a minor one called Climate Research, and the paper was by Willie Soon and Sally Ballianes. Here's what I said back then. Their work wasn't original research. It was a review of around 240 previously published studies. They looked at climate proxy records such as tree rings, lake sediments, and ice cores over the last 1,000 years and concluded that overall the 20th century dose to contain the warmest anomaly of the past millennium. The problem with the paper wasn't that it contained mistakes and the methodology was flawed. A lot of papers get published and then mistakes and flaws are found afterwards. The problem was that the mistakes were so obvious and the methodology so clearly flawed, climatologists say the paper should never have been published in the first place. Even authors of the papers being cited as source material objected to the way their work was misinterpreted. One problem may have been that Soon and Baliunas, who are astrophysicists, were looking at things like tree ring data with little knowledge or expertise in that field. A number of climatologists later critiqued the study. They found that Soon and Baliunas had confused tree ring growth due to warmth with tree ring growth due to rainfall. They had compared historical proxies with average temperatures for the 20th century as a whole instead of the late 20th century, which is the period of anomalous warming. They had assumed that local variations in temperature could be interpreted as global variations. If this had been an undergraduate paper, it would have been returned with an F. Soon and Baliunas' paper was so bad that half the editorial board of the journal Climate Research resigned after one of the editors was refused permission to publish an editorial pointing out the mistakes. It was hard to understand why lead author Willie Soon went outside his discipline of astrophysics to write a review paper on tree ring dating that drew the opposite conclusion to researchers in that field and was riddled with obvious errors. Later it was found that Soon had accepted around $1.02 million from fossil fuel companies and political lobby groups to write review papers. Apart from the fact that he supposed to declare that on submitting a paper, which he didn't do, there's nothing wrong with that. Soon can take whatever money he wants and submit whatever papers he likes. The onus is on the editors of the journals to keep this crap out of the scientific literature, which is why it was the editor who approved the paper who took the heat, and not Soon. There's no way to make all scientific studies 100% error-free. I'd say that's pretty obvious. Even the best researchers sometimes make mistakes. And each advance, along with better technology, is always improving and refining what we know. So with hindsight, a lot of papers don't get things 100% right, and editors aren't clairvoyant. They can't tell whether another paper written 5 years from now will overturn what they've just published. But that's different to knowingly letting obvious falsehoods infect our body of knowledge. Because there are consequences. Just as the intelligent design paper was cited as legitimate science in a court of law, the Soon and Baliunas paper was cited in Congress when us lawmakers were trying to play down the cause of climate change. This is unbelievable, Boar. I know. Other people post on my channel claiming that even if the research is not tainted by errors, and it does significantly advance the science, it won't get published if it changes the status quo. Not only doesn't that match reality, it makes no sense. Why would journals only want to publish papers that conform to what we already know? Libraries, scientific institutes, and researchers are paying exorbitant subscription fees, sometimes tens of thousands of dollars for a single subscription, in order to learn about the latest advances in science and to further their own research. Why would they bother paying money to read papers that don't do that? No journal would refuse to publish a paper that represents a big advance in an important area of science as long as it's backed by evidence. And why would libraries, researchers, and scientific institutes want to pay a lot of money to subscribe to a journal that publishes phony papers and fraudulent results? If respected journals didn't ensure that the papers they publish are groundbreaking as well as accurate, it would be like, well, let me see if I can think of a suitable analogy. Oh, yes. Obviously, if scientists were ruled by their beliefs rather than evidence, and if journals only published papers that showed those beliefs, we'd never see any of the advances we've seen in science. No journal would have published papers on plate tectonics that contradicted the assumption that the continents were fixed, or the theory that time varies depending on your velocity, contradicting our assumption that time is the same for everyone, or that a tiny amount of carbon dioxide can govern atmospheric temperatures, or that the universe was once the size of a pinhead. From the biggest theories to the smallest discoveries, the whole point of scientific publishing is to advance into the unknown and, if possible, overturn our assumptions. So how can you tell whether a journal is respectable and doing a proper job of peer review, or whether the journal is not worth the paper it's not written on? The first thing to check is if it's listed as a scientific journal on the Master Journals list, which catalogs reputable journals. Libraries will only stock journals that are on the list. If it's on the Master Journals list, the first step is to check the journal's impact factor in Journal Citation Reports. That's the average number of times each of its papers is cited by other studies in a particular year. As a guide, I'd expect a reasonable journal to have an impact factor of at least 2, and a good one would have an impact factor of at least 5. But it varies according to the scientific discipline. And be careful, because there are even funny citation reports out there. And unscrupulous researchers can easily bump up their citation score by churning out nonsense and getting it published. In 2013, a French computer analyst discovered that 120 papers published at science conferences in China had been generated by computers and were scientific gibberish. The papers were later withdrawn. Were later withdrawn. Those two things, whether it's on the Master Journals list and its impact factor in Journal Citation Reports, should tell you most of what you need to know about a journal. It would have allowed you to differentiate between these two journals very quickly. The same goes for the Journal of Natural Pharmaceuticals and the Annual Review of Pharmacology and Toxicology. And if a study is so game-changing it's been brought to your attention, there usually want to be any gray area. An important paper will be in a traditional journal if it's legitimate, or in a poorly cited open access journal if it isn't. That's not to say all open access journals are bad. Of course they are not. Many are beginning to get a good reputation. But most still don't have a reputation to hold, which is why nearly all the fraud, errors, gibberish and retractions are found in these new online journals. Medical journals have been especially prone to a rash of bad papers. As for assessing a paper itself, if it's an older paper, then you can look at the number of citations. Respected and important papers will be cited much more by other researchers. But, as before, be careful and check their citations. Be careful and check. It's now so easy to publish online that an author can easily cite his own paper several times simply to bump up the figures. And sometimes citation isn't an endorsement of the paper, but a criticism. So find out if the paper's been commented on, or corrected, or even retracted. If the paper is very old, has it been superseded by subsequent research? Traditional journals aren't immune to errors, of course. It's just that they get far fewer. And they have other problems like the exorbitant subscription costs and copyright issues that prevent even authors from getting copies of their own papers. Open access may one day become a much better and cheaper way to publish. It's just not there yet. And paying for publication is open to abuse. At the moment, traditional journals are still by far the most reliable way to advance science. And it's a system that stood the test of time for the last 3.5 centuries, taking us from this to this. And that brings us back to the claim of Pons and Fleischmann that got the 1980s media so excited about a new form of limitless, cheap energy. When reporters hear about a new discovery like this, whether they re science reporters or general reporters, they re usually not experts. They can understand what they re-hearing, but they've got no way of evaluating it. By knowing it's been published in a respected, peer-reviewed scientific journal, we can be assured that one or two other experts have fact-checked it and that it has some merit. Had peer reviewers done that with the Pons-Fleischmann experiment before the press conference, they might have red-flagged some of the flaws that were subsequently found. But believe it or not, this is how a lot of people think science should be done. Do away with peer review altogether and open the doors to allowing anyone to publish anything. In other words, turn the scientific literature into the blogosphere. If someone wants to publish a paper saying vaccines cause autism, let them. If they want to say the earth is expanding, what's wrong with that? The highest number of likes gets to be true. Don't you see what's happening here? It's attached itself to me. It's alive. By stifling such novel ideas, they say the scientific establishment is just being closed-minded. We reliving in the world of alternative facts, so schools should be able to use whatever is trending on the internet as teaching material in science class. After all, what's scientific publishing ever done for us? Wait. Since he made this video, there's been another blog posing as a peer-reviewed paper. Of course, copied and pasted by other blogs. It's getting a lot of attention, and it really proves the point we've been making. Writing something and posting it on the internet does not make it a peer-reviewed paper published in a respected scientific journal. A claim that it is totally bogus. This blog was written and posted by James Wallacey, Joseph Dalio, and Craig Idso. The fact that two of them get paid by the Heartland Institute, a political organization lobbying against climate science, isn't really relevant. Neither is it relevant that they get paid rather well for writing these blogs. According to Heartland's leaked 2012 budget, Joseph Dalio gets $500 a month. Craig Idso gets $11,600 a month. What? Anyway, that's not relevant either. And Idso also writes blogs for the Cato Institute, another political organization lobbying against climate science. I don't know how much he gets paid by them, but again, it's not relevant. None of this is relevant if they submit whatever research they do for proper peer review and publication in a respected scientific journal. But if they are not willing to submit it to a respected scientific journal for peer review, then it's just a blog paid for by a political organization to support the conclusion of that organization. And it's a blog that cites other blogs as sources. As for the claim that the blog has been peer-reviewed, getting a bunch of economists, meteorologists, and engineers who agree with your conclusion to state that they agree with your conclusion is not peer review. In the real world, it's the editor of a respected scientific journal who decides who will peer review the paper, and he ensures that they read experts in that field. In scientific publishing, it's not the job of peer reviewers to agree or disagree with the conclusions. It's their job to ensure that the methodology, the calculations, and the conclusions are robust. After all, the Three Stooges could post a blog claiming that humans lived with dinosaurs, and then get a bunch of geologists, economists, and engineers to agree. That doesn't make it a peer-reviewed paper published in a respected scientific journal. So, getting back to the validity blog, what's the bombshell? Well, Wallace, Dalio, and IDSO revealed that NOAA and NASA have adjusted historical temperature data. Yeah, but we already knew that. They've said so publicly. NASA explains this not just on a web page, but in its frequently asked questions. They even wrote papers explaining how and why they made the adjustments. And there have been real peer-reviewed papers published in respected scientific journals substantiating the revised temperature record. Updating data is not the exception in science, it's the rule. As scientists gather more and more data, they get a clearer and more accurate picture of past temperatures. So no, a blog citing other blogs is going to dismantle 100 years of solid scientific evidence. We already know that adjustments are made to temperature data. We know how and we know why. If Wallace, Dalio, and so think there's something wrong with these adjustments, then they have to show it through evidence and publish it as a comment or a response paper. Let other researchers check their facts and point out the flaws. That's how science works. The reason these three authors don't want to do that is because they don't think their analysis would pass peer review, and they're probably right. So instead they post it on the internet because 99 of the people who will read it won't have a clue what it's all about. They'll simply believe the conclusion. Then some of them will write blogs themselves with headlines like NOAA and Met Office falsify temperature data to show warmer temperatures. And those blogs will be copied by other blogs. Eventually, I've no doubt this blog will be cited at a congressional hearing and once again be passed off as a peer-reviewed scientific paper. If you're not worried about that, then at least be worried about the contamination of a scientific field you do care about, like evolution, cancer, GMOS, or vaccinations. And if you don't care about any of these scientific fields being contaminated by crap science, then go live back in the Middle Ages.